Somewhere beneath the waters and along the shores of Lake Superior, thousands of ancient hollows lie exposed, dug out, stripped, forsaken long before the first peoples acknowledged by conventional history ever set foot in this region. Not a handful, not 100, but over 5,000 of them, stretching for hundreds of miles along the lake's edge and across its islands, carved into bedrock at depths that no 19th century mining operation could reach without dynamite and steam. This copper was extracted by hand, using stone hammers and fire, broken free from the rock, hoisted upward, and transported elsewhere. And here lies the puzzle that grips anyone who encounters it. Archaeologists have calculated the volume of copper removed from this ground. The tolley reaches into the hundreds of thousands of tons, some estimates approaching 500,000. So, here is the riddle that has gone unsolved for a century and a half. Where did it all go? It does not appear in the burial sites of the region's inhabitants. It is not found in their implements, which contain only fragments compared to what was excavated. It is absent from this continent in any quantity that approaches what vanished from beneath Superior. A fortune in pure copper, extracted from the earth by hands that the established narrative claims could not have been present, disappeared without a trace. The conventional explanation naturally emerged: indigenous peoples mined small amounts of copper for decorative items and trade. Nothing mysterious. Move along. Yet, examine the pits themselves, their quantity, their depth. What lay at the bottom of the deepest ones when early settlers descended with lanterns? And that tidy version begins to collapse like an aging mine shaft. What remains are unresolved questions. Who carved 5,000 mines into solid rock long before recorded history? Where did all that copper end up? A wealth of metal that resides in no museum and no tomb. And why were the findings from the deepest pits mentioned only briefly, then flooded, backfilled, erased from discussion? If narratives like this captivate you, the overlooked, the inconvenient, the ones stricken from the official timeline, subscribe, because each week we explore the buried ancient world, and investigations like this get suppressed by the algorithm unless you indicate otherwise. Now, let us descend into the deepest mines beneath Superior and see what remains at the bottom. To understand why the copper poses a problem, you must comprehend the scale. Because the scale is where the simplistic story fractures first. This is not a scattering of shallow gouges where someone pried loose a nugget. The pit district runs along Superior's southern shore and extends to Isle Royale, remote island in the frigid waters where the excavations form lines miles in length. Some pits are shallow, others drop through solid bedrock far deeper than a man's height, tracking veins of metal into the darkness with a tenacity that indicates genuine, sustained effort. Not a single season's work, but generations of it. And the copper here is distinctive in a significant way. Is native copper, almost pure, embedded in the rock in masses ranging from tiny grains to slabs weighing tons. The miners did not smelt ore, pursued pure metal through stone and fractured it loose. To move the quantity that is unaccounted for, this must have been an operation that persisted for an extended period, involving a large and organized workforce returning to the same terrain year after year, century after century. That is not the signature of a few individuals crafting trinkets. It is the signature of an industry, and an industry requires miners to sustain it, camps to shelter them, boats to transport the metal, and a destination for all that copper. The peoples living around Superior when Europeans arrived did use copper, yes, sparingly, in small crafted pieces, with no memory or tradition of mining on anything near this magnitude. They did not claim the pits as their own creation. When questioned, they referred to the excavations as ancient, the work of those who came before. So, the labor that emptied these mines belonged to someone. That someone left behind an enormous void in the earth and little else, which is precisely where the difficulty begins. The pits were rediscovered in the 1840s. Copper rush brought prospectors and mining companies swarming to the Superior shore, and the peculiar thing is how they located the best veins, by following the work of those who had been there first. Repeatedly, miners cutting into a promising hillside would break through into an older excavation, a pit already sunk along the very vein they were pursuing. the ground already opened by hands that had come and gone ages before. The ancient miners had found the richest copper on the lake, and the modern companies, for all their steam and dynamite, were largely just reopening mines that were already there. At the bottoms of those old pits, beneath collected rainwater and centuries of debris, the prospectors discovered the tools of the people who had excavated them. Stone hammers by the thousands, rounded beach cobbles hafted and worn, sometimes piled by the ton around a single working, charred wood, where fire had been set against the rock to crack it, and here and there, something that halted the diggers in their tracks, masses of native copper, partially freed from the stone, raised on timber supports and then abandoned, left in place, as if the people who had expended unimaginable labor to loosen a multi-ton slab had simply walked away and never returned. The men who found these things were practical prospectors with no reason to fabricate a mystery. They wanted copper, not enigmas. They could not explain why a slab worth a fortune in effort had been lifted, propped, and left, or why the people who left it never came back. Deeper the companies dug into the old workings, the stranger the picture became. Set aside the missing copper for a moment, because the deepest pits held things stranger than absence. The accounts from the early mining era describe ancient workings that descended far deeper than anyone expected hand tools and fire could achieve. Shafts sunk through solid rock to depths that would challenge a modern crew, with no indication of how the excavators had removed the broken stone, ventilated the depths, or kept the water at bay. At the bottom of some, the prospectors found those great copper masses cradled on the remains of wooden supports, the timber so old it crumbled at a touch, the metal showing the marks of stone tools where the excavators had begun to free it before they stopped. The supports imply engineering, the knowledge of how to lift and brace tons of metal in a deep, wet shaft. The abandoned slabs imply something else, something harder to name, a sudden total ending. People do not invest generations of brutal labor opening a mine, get a fortune in pure copper to the very edge of recovery, and then leave it propped on timbers and vanish. Not unless something happened to them all at once that ended the work for good. The lowest reaches of these mines were not the crude scratchings the easy story describes. They were the deep end of a genuine operation, executed with a level of skill that the official picture of the region's past has no room for, and then stopped mid-motion, as though the excavators had set down their hammers one day and never picked them up again. The men who climbed down into those depths with lanterns came back up describing work that should not have been possible for the people history allowed to be there. The question of who those people were only sharpens when you ask the thing the prospectors asked. Where did they go? Here is the part that turns a mining mystery into something colder. A workforce large enough to move hundreds of thousands of tons of copper over centuries is not a handful of wanderers. It is a population, miners, families, people who fed and housed and cared for them, living and dying on that shore in great numbers across a very long time. A population that size leaves more than holes in the ground. It leaves villages, cemeteries, generations of bones, the dense wreckage of ordinary life. And around the ancient copper district, that wreckage is strangely, stubbornly thin. The pits are everywhere. The people who dug them are almost nowhere. There is no great burial ground of the miners, no ruined city of the copper workers, no layered record of a civilization that lived on that shore long enough to empty 5,000 mines. They left their hammers by the ton and their copper half freed in the depths, and of themselves they left almost nothing the official record will fully claim. So, possible facts sit side by side. The copper is gone. 500,000 tons of it vanished off the continent. And the miners are gone. An entire working population that should have left a deep human imprint and instead left mostly silence. Whoever they were, they came to this cold shore. They outmined every culture the textbooks grant the region. They shipped a fortune in metal to somewhere that holds no trace of it, and then they ended abruptly enough to leave slabs propped on timber in the dark. And once you accept that both the copper and the people are genuinely missing, you are standing at the edge of a question the comfortable answers exist to keep you from asking. Follow that question, and it leads somewhere the textbooks are built to avoid, because the whole accepted picture of early North America depends on this shore having been thinly peopled by small groups with simple tools and small ambitions. Mining operation that ran for centuries, organized enough to sink deep shafts and crib multi-ton slabs, large enough to strip 500,000 tons of metal from the rock, does not fit inside that picture. It is too big, too skilled, too industrial. So, it has to be shrunk to fit. The 5,000 pits become native copper collecting. The deep engineered shafts become shallow diggings. The missing 500,000 tons becomes a rounding error nobody is asked to account for. None of that is done by conspiracy. It is done by a quieter habit of mind. Evidence is too large for the frame. You do not rebuild the frame. You trim the evidence until it slips inside. And then you stop looking at the part that still hangs out. The part that hangs out here is enormous. It is an entire industry and an entire workforce, both vanished on a continent that was supposed to be an empty wilderness, waiting for newcomers to civilize it. This is not the only place the wilderness story springs a leak. All across the Americas there are works too old, too large, or too skilled for the people the textbooks place their earthworks, stoneworks, and now a copper industry that outproduced anything the official past allows. Each is explained down to a manageable size on its own. Taken together, they describe a continent that was worked, organized, and inhabited on a scale we were told it never reached. What happened to the superior pits once the companies had taken what they wanted shows how the leak gets sealed. You would expect the ancient mines to have become monuments, studied, mapped, protected, the great unsolved riddle of the lake. Instead, they were consumed. The copper rush that rediscovered the pits also destroyed them, because the modern companies wanted the same metal the ancient miners had been after in the same ground. The richest old workings were exactly the places the new mines went, and reopening a vein meant cutting straight through the ancient evidence, blasting out the old pits, dumping the stone hammers as worthless rubble, and sinking modern shafts where the old ones had been. The very fact that led the prospectors to the copper, the ancient work, was obliterated by the act of mining the copper. What the companies did not destroy, and the years took. Pits filled with water and debris. Isle Royale far out in the cold was logged and dug, and largely emptied of its loose copper, its diggings left to the weather. The tools were scattered, the slabs were carted off and melted down. The careful question, who did this and where did the metal go, was buried under the noise of an industry that had no interest in riddles and every interest in ore. By the time anyone thought to ask seriously, most of the ancient record had already gone through a smelter. No one had to suppress the mystery of the copper. The hunger for the copper erased it. The pits were not hidden. They were mined out a second time by people who saw only metal where a vanished civilization had left its single largest mark. A thing destroyed in the rush is not a thing that never was. The hammers were real, piled by the ton. The empty pits were measured. The missing tonnage was counted before it could be argued away. So, hold on to what the second mining could not consume, because the numbers outlived the pits. Before the ancient workings were blasted apart, they were seen, measured, and described by the prospectors and early surveyors who found them, and those measurements are the part no smelter could melt down. The count of pits ran into the thousands. The stone hammers were tallied by the ton. The depth of the deepest shafts was recorded, and above all, the estimate of the copper removed was made and has never been honestly closed. Hundreds of thousands of tons set against the few worked scraps that survive in the region's known cultures. That gap is a fact written down before anyone had a reason to shrink it, and it does not go away because the pits are gone. Subtract everything that was destroyed, and you are still left with the arithmetic. And the arithmetic is merciless. This much metal came out, this little can be found. The difference left the continent by hands, and by routes the official story does not record. And the superior pits are not the only American work that refuses to fit its assigned size. The same shore that gave up impossible mines sits on a continent dense with earthworks and structures that strain the story of who was here and what they could do. The accepted record says a few simple people scratched a little copper from the lake. The pits, the hammers, the engineered depths, and above all, the missing 500,000 tons say something the record cannot hold, that an organized people mined this shore on an industrial scale, shipped a fortune in metal away to somewhere we cannot name, and then ended so completely that we are left arguing over their tools, which leaves the question that has sat at the bottom of these shafts since the first lantern went down. What does it mean that 500,000 tons of pure copper were taken out of the ground beneath Lake Superior before written history began, by people who left their hammers piled by the ton and themselves almost nowhere, and that the metal sits in no grave and no museum on this continent? It means the past of this shore was larger, busier, far older than the tidy account handed to us in school, the one where an empty wilderness waited quietly for newcomers to arrive and make something of it. It means that long before that story starts, someone was here in numbers, working this cold ground with skill and organization, sinking shafts and cribbing slabs, and shipping metal out across a scale of time and distance that the official picture cannot contain. The copper did not collect itself, and it did not stay. It was mined by a people the record will barely name, and it was carried off to a destination the record cannot supply. And both the people and the metal went out of the world so cleanly that all we have left is the hole they dug and the tools they dropped. No one ever produced the burials to match the labor. No one ever found the missing metal. No one ever explained the slabs left propped on rotting timber in the deepest dark, as though the work had stopped between one swing and the next. The companies that rediscovered the pits did not solve them. They mined straight through them and melted the answer for profit. The easy story that calls an industry a hobby and a vanished people a footnote was written by us, not by the ground. Ground still holds the shape of the truth in 5,000 emptied pits along a cold northern lake. The copper is gone. The miners are gone. The pits are still there, and the question is still in them. If you have come this far, you already feel the size of what is missing from the story we were given. Pass this to one person who has started to wonder where it all went, and we will meet you at the bottom of the next shaft.